Knowing the use case, or like in scientific terms, knowing our hypothesis, our objectives. If we don't have that, it's going to be very difficult because it starts with data collection. It goes on to processing the data and analyzing the data. If we don't do that in a particular way for the use case that we're talking about, it's probably not going to be done right.
Welcome to the Conversations on Applied AI podcast, where Justin Grammons and the team at Emerging Technologies North talk with experts in the fields of artificial intelligence and deep learning. In each episode, we cut through the hype and dive into how these technologies are being applied to real-world problems today. We hope that you find this episode educational and applicable to your industry, and connect with us to learn more about our organization at appliedai.mn. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Conversations on Applied AI podcast. Today on the program, we have Tyler Nigon. Tyler is a PhD candidate in land and atmospheric science at the University of Minnesota's Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. Tyler is passionate about sustainable agriculture productivity. His research focuses on evaluating remote sensing and other precision agricultural tools, and reduce fertilizer loss and keep our soil and water resources clean and productive. Tyler's been learning and applying AI techniques during his statistical training and graduate studies, as he finds AI to be a useful tool in the agriculture sector, not only in research, but in practice as well. Tyler also recently co-founded Insight Sensing, together with another fellow PhD candidate at the U, as a part of the National Science Foundation Small Business Technology Transfer Program. So really, really cool stuff Tyler's involved in. Thank you, Tyler, for joining us today.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I gave a little bit of bio, kind of what you're currently doing. Kind of curious maybe to rewind the clock back, maybe a couple of years, I guess, and maybe talk a little bit about how you got to where you're at today. Maybe, what did you work on in your undergraduate? What got you excited about this field?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you don't mind, I'll maybe go back even further than that. I
Absolutely.
actually grew up on a dairy farm in central Wisconsin. My parents still own and operate that farm. And really, that farm, I grew up throughout my childhood, became very interested in agriculture. And so it really started with that. We are a dairy farm, but we are also a diversified farm and have more than just dairy. So I don't know how to put this other than I wasn't really passionate about cows. And to get into dairy, you have to really, really love them. But I did really like the other aspects of the farm. And so I went to college and did a soil science major. Not too long into college, I was kind of looking to get a minor to diversify a little bit. And I stumbled across a GIS, Geographic Information Systems, really kind of the study or the practice of processing and interpreting spatial data. With that, I got involved with a couple of remote sensing classes and learned all about satellite sensors and image sensors. And all the while, I'm learning about soil fertility, conservation in agriculture, and things like that. And so I was looking for a way, to really bring these things together. And when I was finishing up undergrad, I was looking into graduate programs, and I really didn't even have an idea what graduate school was. Research was something that scientists do, and I had really very little knowledge of that. So I just started emailing. I had advisors at University of Wisconsin Stevens Point, where I did my undergrad, kind of helping me out through that, and I got really lucky. Found a research group, Dr. Carl Rosen and Dr. David Mola at the University of Minnesota said, yeah, we just got this grant where we're looking to find the relationship between nitrogen and water stress in potatoes with hyperspectral and thermal imagery. And so, I knew a little bit about hyperspectral at that time, but I'm like, oh, this is great. This is perfect.
Yeah.
So I applied and was accepted. And I did my master's degree then at the University of Minnesota, working on potatoes.
Okay. What was the focus of that? I mean, was it really around this spectral imagery stuff, or?
Yep, really around the spectral imagery. So the problem at hand is just that, okay, potatoes are grown in sandy soils, and just because they would need to be well drained, they require a lot of nitrogen fertilizer. They're irrigated because of the sandy soils, and they just tend to leach a lot of nitrate from the fertilizer. And nitrate in the groundwater is a problem. It requires treatment and it's really a pollutant. So we want to be able to keep that out and really manage and apply the fertilizer nitrogen as efficiently as possible. And so, as it relates to the aerial imagery, the idea was to train statistical models, machine learning, AI, to be able to use aerial imagery to make predictions about the nitrogen status of the crop during the season. And so, potato growers are oftentimes putting nitrogen fertilizer on 4 or 6 times a year through the months of June and August. And so there's all this opportunity then to take the aerial imagery, if we're able to make predictions about nitrogen status, and use that as kind of a management tool to more efficiently and effectively apply the fertilizer.
Gotcha. And where does this imagery typically come from? Are we dealing with drones and stuff right now, or is it just a lot of planes that are still flying over?
Well, it's an evolution over the years. So, we've had access to this aerial imagery for decades. In the
Decades.
70s when Landsat was deployed, we had this multispectral imagery, and there was a lot of work done back 10 years ago. I mean, we didn't really have consumer grade drones that were easy to just, put your camera on and go fly. So it's really changed a lot in the last 10 years from satellites and manned aircraft to now we're able to mount these cameras and sensors on drones, which is a big deal because the expense, it's a balance between data quality and cost. In satellites, relatively cheap. I mean, as long after it's actually deployed, relatively cheap, but we're dealing with pretty coarse spatial resolution, clouds, not a very frequent revisit time. And so a lot of times we're even lucky to get one image every 2 to 3 weeks. Manned aircraft, that's actually how we collected the imagery for my master's research project. I remember, there's a group out of Nebraska that came and flew a plane up, and they have a hyperspectral and a thermal camera mounted. And just to give an idea of the cost, I remember it being right around $10,000 per image campaign. So to do this research in 2010 and 2011, we had to pay right around $40,000 to do 2 years of research where we're only getting 2 image dates.
Wow.
And so then, just kind of moving along the timeline, really in 2013, 2014, consumer grade drones became a thing. And then bigger consumer grade drones became a thing. And now we're mounting these sophisticated sensors on a $10,000 drone, still rather expensive, but just for context, that's the same price we were paying for just one image campaign.
Sure.
Not very long ago.
Yeah, no, the cost of the technology is always sort of dropping, which is great for startups that want to get into this business. Like you probably are leveraging some of that in your new endeavor. And then also just making it more and more generally available to the average farmer. Because I would assume, I was thinking about your background a little bit. I mean, you said your parents were on this farm and you grew up on the farm. I mean, were your grandparents on a farm too? Was this kind of a generational thing for you to sort of break away and start getting more into this stuff, I guess, rather than sort of having a life as a farmer?
Yeah, absolutely. Both of my grandfathers were farmers or had farms themselves. And, and as I mentioned, I didn't really have a whole lot of exposure to like, okay, what is graduate school? What is the research side of things? And certainly didn't know a whole lot about sensor technologies and AI and things like that. And so I had to make the decision. I mean, that decision really came between my undergraduate and when I started my master's program, because that was something that, I remember having the conversation with my parents, something that they weren't familiar with at all. And they're like, well, why would you want to go to more school when you can have a job? And well, it's like, there's more out there. I don't know what that is yet, but I want to find out, and I can always come back, if I don't like it.
For sure. Yeah, not to take it off too much on a tangent. I was just thinking about, there's a book that I'm reading by Kevin Scott. He's the CTO of Microsoft, and the book is called Reprogramming the American Dream. And when we publish these podcasts here, I'll have a link off to it and some of these other things that we've talked about. But it's a really, really good book. And he grew up in rural Virginia, I think, and his whole story is really about how a lot of these rural communities need to modernize. And he talks a lot about AI and about how AI is going to change the workforce in general. And honestly, there's a lot of mundane work that people are doing that they actually don't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Most, correct me if I'm wrong, but he's kind of saying, most farmers don't want to drive the tractor back and forth 50,000 times. They would much rather automate that. And so the whole thing is that everyone gets gravitated to these cities, and that's where the knowledge center is, and no one goes back. And so he's really trying to have a very strong initiative with regards to having schools rurally, like right in the rural communities, be able to teach these advanced techniques in AI and machine learning and deep learning. Like, why are they only available at the University of Minnesota? Why are they not available in all these other areas? So, I don't know if you have any future plans or whatever, but it's a really good book. It's called Reprogramming the American Dream.
Okay. Yeah, I'll definitely take a look into that. And, following up with everything you said, I mean, that's really what we're trying to do. I mean, I would say both in the research, precision agriculture research, but especially with the NSF grant and co-founding of Insight Sensing, is to be able to take this technology to the practitioners, take it to the farmers so they can use it. And that has its own set of challenges, but it's definitely interesting. And as you said, much needed.
For sure. So you mentioned a couple terms here as you were sort of walking us through what you've been doing. One of them is just this idea around remote sensing. And I think, I'm in the field, sort of you're in the field, but maybe people listening, that might have been a new term for somebody. Do you have a definition, of that, of how you think of what remote sensing really entails and means?
Yeah, absolutely. So remote sensing is just the acquisition of information about an object without coming into physical contact with that object. So at the most basic level, we can think of our eyes as remote sensors. If we look across the street and see a tree there and see that the leaves are changing colors, we can make inferences then from what our eyes see. And this is really kind of been used as a term when we start to use sensors, cameras, to make interpretations about the environment around us based on what those pixels are picking up.
Gotcha. You talked about some challenges maybe with regards to using drone and satellite imagery. I know before you and I had started the conversation, I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, with regards to some of the challenges and trying to train a model with various sensors and make predictions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start by saying, okay, the availability of consumer grade drones has done a lot on the front of collecting data. As long as the weather is okay, we're able to go out, collect the data, and store it in our computer, our hard drive. But there's a lot of processing that has to be done with imagery. And with satellite sources and even a lot of manned aircraft, they understand these remote sensing tasks that more or less kind of clean up and calibrate the data, and that a lot of scientists, even using platforms from satellites and manned aircraft, didn't really have to deal with, because it's either a public program with a lot of thought going into it, or it's like a manned aircraft system where you're paying to get that service. So the data is coming to you like ready to analyze or post process and analyze and then interpret. But now with drones, it's kind of turned that on its head, because now you can throw any camera on there. But when it comes to using this aerial imagery and calibrating or using it in a model, artificial intelligence and such, we have to do a fair amount of processing to be able to ensure or have confidence that the pixels are representing some physical value. One of these things is to convert to absolute units of radiance and then to reflectance. So when you get an image from a camera sensor, it's represented in digital numbers. It's just some arbitrary number based on the exposure time of the camera and the gain and offset that it was set. And it'll be, for an 8-bit camera, which doesn't really exist, but it's a good example, the pixel values are going to be between 0 and 255. Well, for, if the pixel value is 212 or something like that, what does that mean in our physical world? And so when we're collecting the imagery, we have to do some extra steps. And there's different ways to collect the data required to make that calibration. One would be to put down a reference panel into the field. So when we go and capture the imagery, this reference panel, we're also capturing an image of that and then more or less correlating it to the known physical radiance and reflectance values of that panel.
Mm-hmm.
There are other sensors out there, downwelling irradiance sensors that are mounted maybe right on the drone that are kind of keeping an eye on the light conditions every second or every millisecond. Because, and this is kind of the point behind all of this, is that when we're outside, there's clouds in the sky and the lighting conditions are really changing every second, very frequently, and we have to be able to account for those lighting conditions, because otherwise our imagery is just going to be so noisy. And when we put that data into the model, the noise will just be too much for it to generally be able to predict anything meaningful.
So to clarify, I guess when you're up and you're taking these images, you've talked about different types of, I guess there's thermal imagery. So you're basically looking at heat, I guess, coming off. Hyperspectral, maybe you could define that a little bit for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one that catches up a lot of people. So I'm plenty used to it. So hyperspectral versus multispectral. So we're talking in the visible and the near infrared region of the electromagnetic spectrum. So from about 300-400 nanometers up to maybe 10,000 nanometers is getting into thermal. But really, without getting too much into the technical details of the sensor, we're mostly capturing information from 400 to 1,000 nanometers. Now, multispectral, this is more common, generally cheaper. It's fairly subjective, but it indicates that there are multiple spectral bands that we're sensing. Okay. And so the camera on our cell phones, this is what we're used to seeing oftentimes. It's really a combination of red light, green light, and blue light that, when in combination with each other, kind of mimics the human eye in what we're seeing. But we can put a band in there for near infrared, or maybe two near infrared bands, one at 800 nanometers, one at 900 nanometers. This would be multispectral. Hyperspectral is now, instead of like 5 bands, we might have a band every 2 or 3 nanometers. So between 400 and 1,000 nanometers, we might have 250 bands, which really gives us the spectral precision aspect of it. When we kind of move along the spectral domain, we can see, okay, how does the reflectance change? How does the energy coming off of an object change when we just move from, the middle of the green spectrum to just 2 nanometers away, which it would be really impossible for our eye to pick up. And so to really digitize this signal, it's really beneficial.
Sure. Now, so I guess to back up too even further, are we just looking at plants here? Is that the whole point of a lot of this stuff, is based on all this imagery, whether it's thermal or spectral or hyperspectral, multispectral, whatever it is? Maybe you can give us the use case that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because this is a really important thing as well, the use case. And so many times over the last 10 years since I've really been involved with this work, we learned that, okay, we have the data, we have a camera, let's apply it to agriculture to fix all of a farmer's problems. I don't know that I've seen that work even once, other than maybe for scouting. So knowing the use case, or like in scientific terms, knowing our hypothesis, our objectives, if we don't have that, then it's going to be very difficult, because it starts with data collection. It goes on to processing the data and analyzing the data. And if we don't do that in a particular way for the use case that we're talking about, it's probably not going to be done right. So to answer your question, what are the use cases? I am applying the aerial imagery and the spectral domain to really look at the in-season nitrogen status of corn. I never, got into my dissertation research in my PhD program here, but I'm looking at nitrogen uptake, nitrogen status in corn. Similar to potatoes, corn take a fair amount of nitrogen fertilizer, and we want to apply that as efficiently as we can. We also recognize that in one area of the field, it doesn't require as much nitrogen fertilizer as another area of the field that might have more nitrogen available in the soil, or might not use as much because it doesn't have as much crop potential or yield potential. And so nutrient management is a big one. And yeah, we're looking at the plants. We're looking at basically the color of the plants and how they are changing throughout the season and throughout space to understand its status, how stressed it is, or if it feels pretty good and it doesn't need more fertilizer, for example. And then making management decisions on that. Others in my lab are working on phenotyping. So plant breeding,
Okay.
where the breeders are generally looking to make plants more robust to our changing environment. Things with climate change, trying to expand crops into new regions.
Sure.
There are a lot of breeding efforts going into finding out, okay, how can we achieve a high yield so the farmer can earn a living growing it, but in the meantime, having the ability to, or breeding it in such a way that it's resistant to disease or some maybe drought stress or flooding, things like that. So these breeders, they're making DNA sequencing and they're playing their numbers game. But part of any breeding program is the phenotyping aspect. So they're growing the different lines out in the field. And so now we're applying these AI machine learning models to the data that we collect over those fields, whether it be soil sensors, weather data, aerial imagery, where we're looking at the biomass change, the nutrient composition. And there it's really a lot more open-ended on exactly what they're looking for, because it depends on what they're trying to breed for. So that's another example.
So they might just take a new corn species, I guess, for lack of a better term, but it's something that's been modified, and they might just try planting it in some different environment. Hey, we've never planted corn in, I don't know, Tennessee, right? So let's just try planting it in Tennessee. Let's use these sensors, this imagery. I like to talk a little bit more about the soil sample too, because I want to touch on some of that stuff too. But yeah, let's get all this data around it, and then we can really see how it's performing and kind of rinse and repeat.
Yep, absolutely. And so we're getting to the point some breeding labs at the University of Minnesota are now incorporating some of these machine learning models that have been developed, in the past few years into their actual programs. So now instead of just being research on the technology, now it's applying the technology to do the research that they're really interested in, which is really where we want to be with everything, right? To be able to apply it and use it.
Right, exactly. So you can get images from drones and from the sky and all that type of stuff. Do you find, you mentioned soil, which I think is key. I mean, do you think? I mean, I guess any data scientist wants more data.
Yes.
Does it open up a whole new realm of things for you to have that? Is it a complete game changer to be able to know what's going on in the soil? And of course, there's lots of questions around that too. It's moisture levels, but it's probably also nitrogen, and there's probably just a lot of other chemicals. How do you see that playing in?
Yeah, and this is probably something most data scientists would tell you, that this, remote sensing aerial imagery is just another tool in your toolbox. And I've kind of focused on that because that's where a lot of my efforts and experience have really focused in the last several years. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there's all this other information that we really want to be able to get access to. And really, we're trying to understand the soil and what's there, what's not there, what we might have to supplement. And remote sensing is oftentimes limiting when it comes to the soil, because if we're imaging, we can only really see the surface. And the plant roots obviously go down several inches or feet even to capture the moisture and the nutrients that they need to grow. And so this is where other information works in. And this is where I would say I'm really focused with insight sensing and being able to bring this technology to practical use to farmers. Because first off, a really practical thing to consider with aerial imagery is that even with a drone, if a farmer has a few thousand acres, it's still not practical to go fly that drone to cover all of your acres, even once a week, until we get to the point where humans are not involved in the equation and they can go collect the data, process the data, analyze the data, recharge their batteries. That's really not a feasible solution right now at the scale of farms that we're dealing with. with cost considered, we're dealing with satellite imagery. So one of the problems now with satellite imagery is that the revisit time isn't all that great. Like I had mentioned earlier, every couple weeks the satellite might come over. We're not getting a really fine, detailed look at the crop. So the pixel size is usually right around 3 meters or 10 meters. And so it's a really coarse look at the plants. It's really the plant canopy. Things are changing pretty drastically with PlanetScope imagery on satellites, but they have problems of their own. They're getting 50 centimeter resolution or 50 centimeter pixel size, but the radiometric quality is much to be desired. So like putting that into a machine learning model, really we found it doesn't work very well. So how do we use this satellite imagery to be able to make these predictions, but make the predictions on a daily basis instead of a monthly basis? And the answer right now is incorporating things like weather information from weather stations that we have right out in the field, or from modeled weather from weather services and radar and things like that. Management information is a big one. I mean, this is maybe really old fashioned, but knowing the farmer's plans, usually the farmer, they make their plan for how they're generally going to manage a crop in the wintertime. And usually it's the same year after year after year. And just kind of knowing the practices that a particular producer uses can be really valuable for building the models or maybe making separate statistical models for each use case. And then, of course, I think IoT and getting cheap sensors, as they're becoming cheaper and cheaper, things like soil temperature, soil moisture, and getting them out in the fields to be able to access that data as well is really something that is really exciting. On this topic, I heard of some research that's going on where they don't have anything working yet. This is like really basic research and trying to get it. But the goal is to build these decomposable sensors that are pennies, so 5 cents or less, where they can just put it in the fertilizer and spread it out in the field, and it'll sit on the soil surface, and we'll be able to communicate and contribute data to a model to really be able to get information about the soil, the environment in every particular area of the field at a very high resolution in both space and time. It's hard to believe, but I mean that it'll ever be possible. But I mean, think 20 years down the road, it might be, okay, these sensors cost $1 or $2. Maybe they're not quite that cheap, but it's something that's really exciting for a data scientist to think about in agriculture.
Yeah, if you have that many features, I guess, for lack of a better term, I guess when you load it into your deep learning model, the better, because that's what it sort of thrives on, right? When you're doing deep learning, it's learning itself. So the more rows and features and columns you can give it, the more likelihood you will to have better predictions. The hard part, I think, with some of these sensors today, I think it's just the connectivity. Is it cellular? Obviously there's no Wi-Fi out there. Like, how can you daisy chain these things together and create some sort of a mesh network? I think these will all be solved. I know they will all be solved, but it is a little bit of a challenge, I think, right now. And you guys are probably seeing it with your company, as well. I don't know if you guys are offering sensors and stuff like that to put out in the field, or how you guys are overcoming some of that stuff.
Yeah, it is a challenge, and especially in a lot of the rural areas where there's farming. I think it's not as bad as you might think. There is generally good cell reception, out in a lot of rural areas, but it's not as great as in the city. And so, like, it can be a problem sometimes where, okay, your sensor goes offline for a couple days. Now with insight sensing, currently, I mean, we're like I said, really early stage. I mean, this only started a year ago, and we're just trying to build a commercialized product that is halfway scalable to be able to expand in the future seasons. So we're not focused on hardware or getting hardware out there ourselves. With that said,
Gotcha.
we've kind of identified, some more or less standard pieces of hardware, things like weather stations and soil temperature, soil moisture, that we want to be able to use those features because we understand their importance for understanding nitrogen status in crop.
For sure. So So we talked a lot about getting the data, right?
Yeah.
And so, a lot of the sensors and some of the imagery, imagine you have this data now. What sort of tools, I guess, and techniques are you applying first, I guess, in your research? And then also, I guess, even further down the road. So then what do you do about it? Like, okay, so we've identified a portion of this field that needs more nitrogen or less nitrogen or whatever. Walk me through also how you solve that problem, as well, because you need to have specialized, probably tractors to make that happen. So I guess maybe start with the first question. So we have all this data. How are you applying that, what you're doing right now to then pinpoint where these issues are at, and I guess utilize AI to the best of what it can be done today?
Yeah, so I'll use, I guess, our beachhead market with potato growers with insight sensing. So potato growers, they have agronomists that are already traveling out to the field and collecting tissue samples, petiole samples, sending them to the lab to get the nitrate concentration. And usually they're doing that weekly. A lot of these farms have someone or multiple people that specifically do this. And so we're already working with potato growers because they're already collecting a lot of the training data that we need.
Nice.
And I think, this is one thing I don't know that I specifically mentioned yet, but training data in agriculture is generally really difficult to come by because it's expensive to collect. There's so many variables that even if you have some data collected, usually you only have a few of the features that you want to use, meaning that, it's may not be that useful. And then we're working on this annual cycle. In our case, June and July are the months to collect all of the data. So there's challenges with that. So like how do we go ahead and use that data then? For the most part, we realize, with this National Science Foundation grant, part of this was customer discovery. And, I've kind of always known this, as a farmer myself, but a lot of these precision ag companies, they will present you with a product where they show you an image that, is a beautiful map or color map, but it might be like relative stress or relative plant status. And, at first, like I would say in 2013, 2015, they were really, not all that transparent that, okay, this is just a relative map. Now I would say there's like an understanding, okay, take this for what it is. It's a relative map that doesn't have any absolute meaning. We're trying to get past that next step. So not provide just like, this colorful map, but provide a colorful map that is representing the units that they're used to dealing with. So I mentioned petiole nitrate concentration. So that's what we want to train the models on to be able to predict petiole nitrate and provide a map in petiole nitrate. So in terms of training the models, this is a supervised regression problem. Honestly, I've, as part of my dissertation research, looked at a few different models: lasso regression, support vector machine regression, random forest, partial least squares regression. Honestly, if you if you have clean data, and this is, maybe a small sample set, so take this with a grain of salt, but if you have good data, clean data, the model I found doesn't really make a whole heck of a lot of difference other than the number of hyperparameters that you have to tune for that model, maybe the efficiency of the model to train and test and cross-validate. Support vector machine is particularly takes a long time to do. Once you have a trained model, though, then you taking new data. For a potato farmer, okay, we get a new satellite image, new weather information, maybe new management information. That farmer applied fertilizer last Thursday. Okay, let's consider that now. And first, update our models. So, to have this all automated is, I think, pretty important because we want to be able to update the models as we get more information. We don't want to train a model and just kind of stick with that, because if that's a bad model, it's going to give us bad information forever. But the idea is if we can kind of keep updating the models, then we will continue to improve in our predictions and hopefully reach some plateau. And then ask the real question to the producer, the farmer: is this accuracy good enough for you? Can you use this in your operation to make management decisions and feel comfortable about it? And, really, frankly, from our perspective, would you pay something for that?
Sure. Is there some value there?
Is there a value there? And that's something that we're trying to figure out. we found to be pretty difficult because a lot of the agronomists, the farmers, I don't know that they know what they want. They just want something better.
Yeah.
It's like you have to build a MVP, minimal viable product, and get it to them before you can really get good feedback. Those are some of the beautiful struggles of a startup.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's also just the nature of the market you're in, right? You're in an emerging area. It's one of these things where it's like, I don't think the consumer would have asked for the iPhone if you said, "Would you like a new phone?" No, they wouldn't have, right? So Apple sort of led that, and it's a balancing act where it's like you got to take input from the customer, but yet, especially in these new and sort of fast evolving technology times, oftentimes they don't know what's possible, and sometimes they don't even know the right questions to ask.
Right.
So it's all about just iteration. I mean, I've done a number of different startups, a number of different companies, and you're right. You're pivoting.
Mm-hmm.
You just got to make sure, okay, I'm going to pivot a little bit over here, pivot a little bit over there, and hopefully over a course of time, you don't run out of money, and B, there is value there, right? At the end of the day, sometimes you're chasing something that you think has some value, and it turns out the customers aren't willing to pay for it,
Really.
and you need to sort of like short circuit that. It sounds like there were a couple of things that were coming to mind when you were talking. One is, it sounded like you were talking about getting very specific and hypersensitive to what they wanted to see, right? It wasn't like, here's how the plant's feeling, or, it's like, no, this is the exact concentration that you need to do, right?
This is
It
the
feels like
same
that.
playing field as what you're doing already. You're already taking petroleum nitrate samples. This is what we're predicting here.
Perfect. Yeah. So that will resonate much better with a customer when you actually try to present a solution to them. I was also curious, like how many, you mentioned training data. So, I mean, obviously they weren't doing these samples back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, right? I mean, how far back do you even have? Do you only have data from the past X number of years, or what's that data set even look like?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting question when it comes to the collaboration between the university and commercializing and working with growers. Yeah. I mean, I don't even know for sure with potato farmers, like how long have they been doing petroleum nitrate sampling? I would say since the 90s, definitely. It's probably a much more prolific part of a management program in the last 10 years. The testing labs have really stepped up their game in terms of getting the samples and doing the wet chemistry to give the results back as soon as possible, like within 24-hour period or less even.
Yeah, I mean, so the samples are there, and it definitely goes back at least a decade, or more. So that helps. I mean, I guess, but there's probably even more refined tests that are going to come out in the future that might be even better. Who knows? I'm guessing the science on this sort of continuously changes.
Right. Yeah. And so one other thing that I wanted to say about this is university research. So in the last 15 years, 20 years even, we've always been, for example, growing potatoes and looking at the effects of nitrogen management on that potato. And even with remote sensing for 20 years, collecting, even if it's not imagery, there's handheld sensors to collect this reflectance information to be able to really evaluate the feasibility. Can we use these sensors to make predictions about nitrogen status? The problem with using some of this old data, whether it's old or not, the problem with using a data set that maybe uses this active sensor to capture reflectance information is that it's not directly transferable to the sensors that are scalable or that we have access to now. And one way to put that is I always say all sensors are not created equal. Getting back to the electromagnetic spectrum and multispectral and hyperspectral, an image band in a camera might be centered on the green wavelength, about 550 nanometers. But camera A might have a 20 nanometer bandwidth, so from 540 to 560, but camera B might have a 40 or 60 nanometer bandwidth. And that's a big problem because the precision on the spectral side introduces noise to that model that really negatively affects our prediction accuracy.
Sure.
So another thing I'm working on the research side is to be able to collect hyperspectral imagery and mimic, if we have the specifications of another sensor that's maybe more scalable, lower cost.
Gotcha.
Try to mimic the specifications of that using this really high resolution. Train our models with that mimicked data,
Sure.
and deploy that trained model kind of using hyperspectral imagery, but it's something that's more specific to what we're actually going to deploy.
Cool. No, that makes a ton of sense. And it's obviously as any sensor evolves and technologies get better, the data, you're right. If it's collected at one point in time versus 5, 10, 15 years later, you got to factor in the hardware
Hmm.
and how it was collected.
Hmm.
You mentioned about training models or deploying models, I guess. Do you guys, how have you been doing that? Have you been running AI sort of at the edge, or have you been shipping data to the cloud? What's your overall game plan?
Yeah, so that's, I guess, future work. So we're not even quite that far yet, I guess, just handling these different data sources and being able to ingest them
Uh-huh.
and working with the farmers to be able to get access to their data. I mean, we didn't even talk about data privacy, but there's a lot of concerns around that as well. But yeah, that is the goal, is to get our database, on the cloud, and our software up there, where every night for a particular field, or
Mhm.
thousands of times within a field, every night, check for new data. If there's new data, make new predictions. If there's data that we can train on, retrain the model.
Mhm.
And getting
Mhm.
that into be an automated flow, I think, is probably the only answer to some of these agricultural problems, because of the specificity of the soils, the climate, the environment. Even on one farm, if we go from one field to the next, it's a completely different ballgame. So if we have one model that works in field A, it's not guaranteed to do all that well in field B, even though they might be across the road from each other.
Wow, fascinating. Yeah, you're right. You're right. It's going to be very, very localized. And of course, probably certain crops, right? So you've got soybeans on one side and you got corn on the other. It's going to be totally different, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's maybe not that big of an issue, just because different crops are managed completely different. And so this gets
Mhm.
back to the question of, what is your objective? What do you want to do? And we got to start there
Yeah.
instead of coming at it from the other way.
Yeah. Instead of just collect all data all the time and we'll figure out what to do with it later.
Right. Because that can be really challenging. I think
Yeah.
a lot of people have tried that.
Yeah, it's like trying to find that one drop in the ocean then, right? Once you
Right.
have all this stuff, it's like, okay, where's that one drop that actually has the value in it?
Exactly.
And so again, I understand sort of the current stage that you're at right now with your operation and your company and your startup and what you're doing in your graduate work. But then I guess, how do you see this being applied, right? So I mean, there are precision sprayers out there and stuff like that. Maybe let me know a little bit about how then you would see this, how you would see a farmer change his or her behavior, right? But now they have this information. Walk me through, would this be loaded into the tractor the next time that they go out and spray the fields, or?
Yeah, something like that. I'll use the example with potatoes again. So they have, we're working with potato growers that use irrigation, and so they'll put on their nitrogen fertilizer through their irrigation system. And the new center pivots, the new irrigation systems, have the ability to load in a prescription where it will adjust the rate of fertilizer or water in any particular area of the field. And so the nozzles then will apply more or less depending on the physical space that they're in.
Gotcha.
The same concept applies to a tractor. When you load it up with fertilizer. I mean, we do have the ability with variable rate technology to load in this prescription, and as we're traveling, we're using GPS and going to the different areas of the field. Different areas of the field then would get a different application rate, or even in some cases, even different product, depending on kind of what we see. Now, this is a whole nother complication where, in precision agriculture generally, just because we have data and information about plant status doesn't necessarily know that we know how to use that
Mm,
to make a prescription. And so this is where expert knowledge of farmers, agronomists, everything that they know about their farm or their client's farm really comes into play to kind of actually make the prescription. And this is something that a lot of farmers, they'll say to me, "Oh, you or agronomists, I should say, who serve the farmers,
mm,
sell seed, fertilizer, and help them with their management decisions." So they'll say, "Oh, you're trying to take away our jobs," and I 100% disagree that that would ever happen, because if anything, there's going to be another job you're going to have to do, and
mm.
it's going to be maybe more important as margins are getting tighter in a lot of commodity crops and things like that.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a whole ecosystem around agriculture, as with probably most other areas. So everyone has their own needs and their own ways that they service it.
Regarding, trust, like a farmer or agronomist and a trust in some prediction, some artificial intelligence model, they've seen too many things that have steered them wrong. The deck is stacked against us when it comes to trying to provide information to a farmer, really a prescription. And so this is something right now, and I think will continue to be for at least a decade, I think, where even if we do have a good prescription, they're going to want to have their fingers on it and be able to make adjustments and really be really involved with that, because they're still the experts on their farm and they know their soil the best. They know how it behaves. And bottom line, it's their livelihood. They're the ones that is putting all the financial risk out there.
Great points, for sure. For sure. Yeah. Trust is a huge thing. It's a whole comfort level. It happens with any new technology. It takes a while for it to be proven and then accepted and then trusted. Mm-hmm. So well put. Well, cool. This has been a great conversation, Tyler. And I definitely appreciate all the time you've given us here to enlighten us here on all the cool things that are going on with regards to agriculture and sensors and AI and everything like that. How would people reach out to you if they wanted to get a hold of you? What's the best way?
I do have a personal website, tylernigon.me. So feel free to visit that to see some of the research projects that I've done relating to precision agriculture and AI and some of the recent publications I've done with my research. I do have a Twitter account at Tyler Nigon. I don't use it very often, but there's that. Otherwise, on the website, you'll see some email information where you'll be able to find an email address to reach out. And I also wanted to just mention my co-founder of Insight Sensing, Brian Bowman. And so, like I said, he's a fellow PhD student. And a lot of the things that I've talked about here, he's been very closely involved with. And so using the potato examples.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I'm checking out your website right now. And you've got a lot of good, really interesting projects that you've been working on, obviously, in this space. For quite some time. So PhD, how far are you, just to kind of like wrap up here, how far are you with regards to being done, and what do you think you're going to do once you are done?
Yeah, that's a really good question. With the startup opportunity and the NSF grant, it's really kind of slowed down my dissertation progress. Okay. Because I'm working on that as well. Now I still am, working as a research assistant at the university, so kind of juggling two things here. And I'm planning to finish up here this winter. I've got to get another chapter written and submitted for publication, and then I think I'll be ready to defend and kind of move on with the next part of my career. I'm taking the startup as serious as I can. I really want it to succeed, or at least be in a place where we have a product that, even if we don't have the means to generate cash flow, to be able to partner with some of these existing players that have deeper pockets, so to speak, to be able to see it through. And now, with that and potentially after that, my whole passion is to bring this technology to farmers, to agronomists. And so I definitely want to stay in the industry. Sometimes people ask, okay, how should I start out? The first thing I say is pick an industry that you're passionate about. And the other things, then they'll come. And if you're passionate about the industry and the work, then as challenging as the problem is, you're going to be able to find a way to solve it. If you're not passionate about the work itself, then it's probably going to be something that is just annoying and burns you out.
For sure. Yeah, it becomes work, actually, but if you're passionate about it, it can actually be fun.
Right.
You can actually enjoy what you do. So that's awesome. That's awesome here that you found your passion, and you obviously are having a lot of fun with it right now. So wish you nothing but the best of luck here with your startup. And there's a lot of agriculture opportunities, it feels like, in the state of Minnesota. We're in the right place of the country to make this happen. So
yes,
that's always
absolutely.
a positive sign. Well, again, I appreciate all the time, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you very much, and thanks again for having me.
Bye.
You've listened to another episode of the Conversations on Applied AI podcast. We hope you are eager to learn more about applying artificial intelligence and deep learning within your organization. You can visit us at appliedai.mn to keep up to date on our events and connect with our amazing community. Please don't hesitate to reach out to Justin at appliedai.mn if you are interested in participating in a future episode. Thank you for listening.